Welcome back for another Wednesday Word of the Week. Lucas, our friend Lucas, has sent us another great question. His question is pertaining to Revelation chapter 11, verse 8. And let us begin with reading that verse from the ESV. But before I read it, this is about the two witnesses described in chapter 11 who are martyred in the streets of Jerusalem. And there's a specific phrase that we're going to look at today. So here is Revelation 11:8 from the ESV. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. So we know Jesus is crucified at Jerusalem, not at Sodom, not in Egypt, right? Bear that in mind for the remainder of our exploration today. Now, let's look down. So the ESV says symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt. Let's look down at what the King James says, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. Then the NIV, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt. And then the RSV, which is allegorically called Sodom and Egypt. So our question this week is about this adverb, pneumatikos. And the question is, the word is obviously rooted in the word spirit, right? Pneuma. Pneumatikos is an adverb spiritually. But some versions, in fact, most versions don't translate it spiritually. They translate it symbolically, allegorically, figuratively, metaphorically, etc. So how are we to treat that word? Well, let's take a look at it in Koine and we'll unpack that today. So the phrase in question, hetis kaletai pneumatikos Sodoma kai Aegyptus. So hetis, which is kaletai, called, and then we get our word of the week, pneumatikos, spiritually, Sodoma kai Aegyptus, Sodom and Egypt. So, which is spiritually, notice I put the question mark there because that's the question. Should we translate this adverb spiritually or should it be figuratively, allegorically, etc.? There are a bunch of translations out there that say, which is prophetically called Sodom and Egypt. In my opinion, that's a terrible translation because prophetically is a loaded term that makes us think that we should be reading much more into this than we should. And we'll continue to deal with that as we go on. So our word of the week, pneumatikos, is an adverb and it modifies, as all adverbs do, a verb. The verb here is kaletai. So, which is called spiritually, figuratively, allegorically, metaphorically, symbolically, Sodom and Egypt. The key here is that pneumatikos is an adverb and that it's not an adjective. If it were an adjective, it wouldn't be modifying the verb called, it would be modifying the noun city. So let's take a look at our word compared to the adjective. So pneumatikos with the omega sigma ending is our adverb, pneumatikos, spiritually or figuratively. The ly ending, li, tells us that we're describing the action of the verb. What's the verb here? Called, which is spiritually or figuratively called Sodom and Egypt. But then we have the adjective, which is pneumatikos, with an omicron sigma ending, and that is the adjective. So think about it with me for a moment. If it weren't the adverb but the adjective, and it was modifying the noun city and not the verb to call, then we would have Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified, would be a spiritual city called Sodom and Egypt. But Jerusalem is not, when we're referring to the crucifixion, Jerusalem is not a spiritual city, it's a literal city where Jesus was actually crucified, right? So it's not a spiritual city being called Sodom and Egypt. It is a literal city with our adverb pneumatikos. It is a literal city being spiritually or figuratively called Sodom and Egypt. It's not actually Sodom. It's not actually Egypt. It's Jerusalem. But the calling is figurative, right? It's almost like a nickname, or in this case, a pejorative for the city, because we're saying it shares some characteristics reminiscent in the time and place. It shared some characteristics reminiscent of Sodom, reminiscent of Egypt. Immorality and things that were in direct opposition to God, right? So an enslaving influence that disregards God for Egypt. A sexual immorality in Sodom. So I think it's clear that we can look at that and say we're talking about a real city, Jerusalem, and the act of calling, the speech act of calling it these other things, is we can take pneumatikos and interpret this as a figurative calling. This is a metaphor. This is symbolic. It's not prophetic. It's not making a prediction about it, or not forthtelling about it. It's like a nickname where you would call somebody, I'm trying to think of a good analogy for the nickname, but you can pick your own, where you would refer to someone using someone else's name to intimate that they're sharing a characteristic. This is a figurative calling of the real Jerusalem as Sodom and Egypt. Right? But now, let's take a look at our word of the week, pneumatikos, our adverb, used in a more literal sense about spiritual things. And we're going to get to see in this passage both the adjective, pneumatikos, and the adverb, pneumatikos, used about spiritual things, not figurative. So this is 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 13 and 14 from the ESV, and I have supplied the Koine words where they go. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. Notice here, pneumatikos here is pneumatikos. Why? Because this is a substantial use, a substantival use, if you will, of the adjective pneumatikos. And it's in the dative plural, 2 or 4 spiritual people. So spiritual things for spiritual ones. Literally here, pneumatikos, pneumatika. Pneumatika is spiritual things. Pneumatikos, 2 or 4 spiritual persons. Now, the rest of the verse, the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. Pneumatikos anakrinetai, spiritually discerned. So the adverb modifying the verb anakrinetai, they are spiritually discerned. So, back to Lucas's initial question. When we see this in Revelation 11:8, should it be spiritually called or figuratively called or symbolically called? I would argue that it's very clear that when we're talking about this sort of verb of communication, calling something, it's not spiritual calling. It's not coming from the Spirit. It's to differentiate it from literal calling. The city in which Jesus was crucified, in which their Lord was crucified, was not Sodom, and Egypt isn't even a city. It's figuratively referring to Jerusalem as Sodom and Egypt. But then we see that the word can very much be taken literally, where we see the adjective and the adverb both talking about spiritual things, right? the act of deliberation can be deliberating spiritually to understand these spiritual things, and not being figurative. So Lucas, I hope that answers your question, and I hope that was informative and enlightening for all of us. Thanks again for the great question, and thanks for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And until next time, Karis Kairene Humin, grace and peace to you.